If you clicked on this, just wanting to see the answer, here it is. I wrote a Python script that was about 500 lines that calculated the efficiency of every basic ally in the game, and then plotted them in order. And feel free to use this as a reference now. But this isn't the full story. And if you're interested, stick around and I'll explain how I did this, what it means, and create a tier list of all the basic allies. So my motivation for doing this was, first off, to create a reference for deck building. And then secondly, I've seen so many arguments online where people are just like yelling back and forth at each other about this ally is efficient. No, this is efficient. No, that card shouldn't be in this deck. And I wanted to provide a framework to actually talk about this more accurately. And then lastly, I love Marvel Champions and love talking about it. So here's how I did it. Start off by talking about what do I mean by efficiency. So efficiency, with how I defined it here, is taking the minimum output of an ally and the maximum output of an ally, and then taking the average of that. So, an example, let's do Angel. He has a true cost of 3, which I have another video where I explain why I'm saying his true cost is 3 when X-Men can play him for 2 printed cost. Basically, it's just to represent that Angel is also a card leaving your hand. And it could have been a resource spent on something else. And so that's like the practical in-game reason. But then there's another reason, which is mathematical in nature, because a lot of the allies, especially with cost reduction and drawing and stuff, if you don't do that and account for cards leaving your hand, like all the cards leaving your hand, not just their printed cost, then they'll often like divide by 0 when you're calculating their efficiency, which isn't accurate because like an infinite efficiency is not actually correct. And it's also harder to think about. So, for example, Angel, his max efficiency would be you play him, he attacks twice, and then he blocks, and then you divide that output that he had by his true cost. That will be his max efficiency, which would be 2.67. Also, I valued block as 4 for this analysis, but I'll go more into that later. So then the minimum efficiency would just be you play Angel, you attack for 2, you block, and then you divide that by the true cost, and then you get a minimum efficiency of 2. So you take the average of that, and then you get that his Angel's efficiency is 2.33. So let's talk about like the assumptions I made and the subjectivity in this analysis. So I structured this code as having global variables that I can adjust very easily. So I mentioned that was like 500 lines, but for example, if you wanted to know, like, I want to fight Ronin, and Ronin attacks for like 8 or 9 almost every time, I could just go in, adjust the value of block to be higher, and then it would update the whole code and then and then I wouldn't have to go in and change every line like that. So block is the first assumption that I made. I chose 4 again because it felt like a good number to represent like the standard of an efficiency. So you think of like Rhino or something. He has 2 attack and gets 2 boosts. That's like a very common occurrence on the first stage. And then it's also pretty likely that like as he flips up, he'll get like 3. He'll have 3 attack and then he could get 1 boost or even 0 sometimes. So I just sort of like average that out to 4. But again, this is a value that you can adjust very easily in this code. And the effects that it would have is cheaper allies are going to be better in expert and against heavy hitting villains like Ronin. And then if you're playing a villain that doesn't do a lot of damage or just like on standard difficulty, then the more expensive allies will get better in relation to this list. So the next assumption I made is that I valued drawing at 1.25. This is to represent that drawing isn't just bringing a resource into your hand, it's also opening up more options for you to play. So you can imagine like a good example of this is like Spider-Man with his backflip. So you draw into a card, and that, let's say it's backflip and the villain's attack. The next assumption I made is that I valued searching the deck at 2. This is just to represent that searching the deck is more valuable than drawing because you get to curate what card you get. So you're not going to just get like a card that is a resource for yourself, basically. You'll get a card that you want to play. And then, again, if these assumptions were changed, the order of the list would be mostly the same. It wouldn't change that much. It would just change like the a few of the like allies would be like a few higher or a few lower, but the general trend would still be the same. Like the allies are at the very top and the valleys are at the very bottom are still going to be at the top and the bottom. It's just like in between there, it would get a little bit different. And every ally has interesting effects. So for if you think about Venom, Venom says after you reveal an encounter card, you deal damage to him, and then you deal damage to the villain equal to the number of icons in the boost area, which that's a random number about how much damage he's going to do. He has to deal damage to himself, and also he has an encounter card. His stat line, though, is insane. Like 6 health, 3 attack. That's incredible, but he has those downsides and that randomness. So allies like Venom were really difficult to fit into this framework, so I separated them all. Allies like Angel were very easy to fit in the framework. So it goes on to my next point, is I separated it into objective allies and subjective allies. And I say mostly subjective because these allies still all have abilities, but they fit very easily into this framework, whereas the subjective allies were very hard to quantify, so I wanted to do that separate. So as you can see here, like Angel is my objective list, Venom is in my subjective list, and for the tier list, I'm going to be starting with the objective allies, placing all of those to get like a framework of how this list is going to work, and something that's actually very accurate and not just my opinion. And then the subjective allies will come in, and I did my best to quantify them, but a few of the allies are going to have to move up and down to represent their abilities. And before I begin the tier list, I wanted to make some general comments about efficiency. Efficiency is a stat that's much more valuable in the early and mid game, and is not directly correlated to late game value. So in the beginning, you're looking to set up your hero, get your upgrades, stay alive, that kind of thing. So you'll be wanting efficient allies at that point. But late game, you still want efficiency, but you're going to value output more than efficiency. And also attack more than thwart, because you're trying to end the game. And some examples of this, 3 allies that I thought were very good to look at are Nick Fury, Dum Dum Dugan, and White Fox. So Nick Fury is almost always referenced as like one of the best allies in the game, and I totally agree. Because if you look at him, in the beginning of the game, he's extremely efficient, because you can use him to draw 3 cards, and he blocks for you and does his 2 thwart and 2 attack. He helps you get set up faster, and he opens up a lot of different plays for you. But then when you're trying to end the game, you'll probably want to choose the 4 damage option, because having him come in doing 6 damage can be like the extra damage you need to beat the villain. Like I've won so many games by playing Nick Fury at the end and dealing 4 damage. So that's why he's so good. He's really good in the beginning of the game, and he's good at the end of the game. And Dum Dum Dugan is an interesting case. You almost never want to play him at the beginning of the game because he's so expensive, and at the beginning you're not generally looking to have the most output possible. Another thing that's interesting about him is he will convert your shield cards that don't do damage, like your surveillance teams and whatnot, into damage, which is an extremely useful effect. And he can attack for 6, which is crazy. So he attacks for 6, he can stick around for another turn, attack for another 6. Like he's great at ending the game. So he's fantastic in the late game, not so fantastic in the beginning. And then White Fox is an incredibly efficient ally because she comes into play for free, basically. Like you discard her off the top of your deck from a different card effect, and without paying for her, all of a sudden you have an ally. So that's extremely efficient. But I guarantee, like, Nick Fury and Dum Dum Dugan, if you're doing a final push at the end of the game, are going to be more valuable than White Fox, even though her efficiency is much higher. So, with that out of the way, I'm going to use this efficiency as a guide to make this tier list, but it's not everything. But it will correlate. It generally correlates with how good an ally is, but it's not directly the cause. So now it's time to jump into the tier list. I already sorted out the objective and subjective allies in the interest of saving time, but first we're going to go over the objective allies. So the tiers I made here are starting with the Masochist tier, where I don't know. I personally wouldn't include these in almost any deck I make unless there's like a specific reason that I want to. Meh, meaning it's fine, but there's a much better options than that ally. Situationally good, which is where a lot of allies are going to go, where you do want them, but there still are better options, but they do something cool. And then great options are going to be cards that go into many different decks and then have generally high efficiency and generally high output. Auto include are cards that if I'm trying to make a strong deck, anything from here upward is just gonna if my character I'm playing has access to it, I'm gonna add it into my deck. Zesty is the Daring Lime special tier, where just very good, but there's a couple allies that fit into this zone where they're basically free, and we'll get to that later. So, for the first ally, it's going to be Atlas Bear, which Atlas Bear makes it into the meh tier. Atlas Bear isn't like horrible, so I wouldn't put it in Masochist tier, but the ability is pretty inconsistent, and there's just better options for allies out there. Now, coming into Blade. Blade is very cheap, but also has that restriction of you have to pay a physical resource in order for him to attack. So oftentimes what happens with Blade is he's like the epitome of a chump blocker, to where you're just going to play him for one. He may activate once or no times, and then he's just gone. It is worth noting, though, that Blade would work very well in a Hulk deck because he's very cheap, and characters with low hand size are going to like cheaper allies. And then also he has physical resources. So I just wanted to mention that. And now we're going to jump a tier. So these are the situationally good ones, which starting with SPDR. So this was kind of a sad case because SPDR's efficiency actually goes down as you if you use her ability, which is it feels bad. But also I've experienced this when playing her, because the main thing I want to do when I play SPDR is just jump block, because generally blocking the damage is going to be more valuable than attacking once and then thwarting for two. So unfortunately, SPDR lands here, but it is worth noting that there is some synergy with web warriors that go on. So that's where the amount of subjectivity comes in with SPDR. But at some point, I did just have to make a cutoff for what I'm defining as subjective or objective, because it's so varied. Then we get into Storm, which the only thing holding Storm back is the cost. The ability to remove 2 threat from a scheme with the thwart and then move 2 from one scheme to another can be really good, but that's why I put it in situationally good, because you kind of have to build around that for it to be that useful. And same thing with SPDR. It's situationally good in web warriors, but outside of that, it's also outside of having this web warrior setup, it's not very good. So out of all the web warriors, they all sort of outclass SPDR. Well, except for one, but we'll get there later. And now we get to Pete Wisdom, which this is a card that I personally underrated. I think mostly because I wasn't valuing the 3 thwart that much. But when thinking about it more, the 3 thwart's very good, and then the chance to like heal a damage, especially when you're fighting a villain that would have mostly treacheries, Pete Wisdom can be situationally very good. So that's why he lands here. And then we're going to get to... Now we get into one of my personal favorites on the allies, Deathlock. Deathlock has such a cool ability where you can go in and then grab an upgrade. So he's very expensive, but when you take into consideration that you can attach a 1-cost upgrade to him, it brings down his cost quite a bit, and it makes his stat line better. So he's actually a pretty good ally. I don't see many people talking about him that much, but he's a solid ally. Now Martin X, just a fantastic blocker, where the only thing really holding back Martin X is the 1 thwart and 1 attack, and the fact that on harder difficulties, Martin X is going to get worse because the 4 health is enough to get 2 blocks on standard, sometimes against certain villains. But then on expert, you're probably rarely going to be able to block twice with Martin X. So that's what's holding him back from being even higher, even though he's cheap. And then we're going to get to War Machine, which War Machine's a pretty solid ally. Tough is always a very good stat because it enables up to 2 blocks, which is incredibly valuable because the blocking with allies is, in general, much more useful than using their stats, especially in the early to mid game. And the only thing holding War Machine back is that ranged is not useful very often. Like, it's situationally useful, but his cost is just too high, which is why he lands in the situationally good tier. And now, Dum Dum Dugan. One of my favorite cards. He's just so fun at the end of the game to like do a giant push. I talked enough about him earlier. And Scarlet Spider. So this is yet another ally that I personally underrated because the revealing an encounter card and calling it and then allowing you to draw a card is really cool. And what I think I didn't realize was that didn't realize like before I made this really was that he can stick around, and if you call the card type wrong, then he doesn't take the damage, which makes him better than a lot of the other people's effects. Also, because he has 2 attack, which is pretty valuable. 2 attack, 4 health is nothing to scoff at, so he can have quite a bit of output, and then also draw you some cards, so he's pretty good situationally. And then the final ally in the situationally good tier is Hope Summers. And I also personally underrated Hope Summers. I haven't played Hope enough, but getting to add the superpower card to your hand is really good and a respectable stat line of 2-2, 2-2 and 3. So definitely an ally that I want to experiment more with going forward. But then you can see that basic allies are actually really strong when you look at them. That because we're already up to great options, which all of the allies in here are going to be very powerful. But at some point the cutoff had to go because like probably around like Deathlock, I'd say. These are all allies that I would consider putting into decks that I make, but there's just better options out there. So get to Colossus, which Colossus is a fantastic ally because he comes in with tough, which again, being able to block twice is incredibly valuable. But he also has 3 attack, so you can choose to like block. You can like block twice with him, then attack for 3, and then block again, which is absolutely incredible. And then you get to reduce the cost down to 3 if you're an X-Men. Which also, again, with Colossus and Angel and Storm, probably almost always only play them if I'm an X-Men. But he's also one that you could consider putting in your deck, even if you're not playing an X-Men. Now Groot. The Guardians allies are historically strong, and that lands Groot here. Because the 6 health stat line means that against most villains in the game, Groot is going to be able to block twice and sometimes even 3 times. And he also has a pretty respectable 2 attack. He's a fantastic ally, but not quite as good as Rocket, who is just the king of killing minions. The +3 attack with Overkill on just a 3 cost ally, so he'll be attacking for 4 with Overkill, is incredible. And against certain scenarios, he just absolutely destroys them. Like if you think about like Drang or Green Goblin or Ultron, fantastic in all those scenarios, a great ally. And then we get on to one of my personal favorite allies, which is Spider-Man Miles Morales, which Miles allows you to add +2 to the chosen stat. So he comes in with 3 health, and he can have either 4 attack or 3 thwart on the first turn for only 3 cost, which is absolutely incredible, and one of my favorite allies in the game. Definitely anytime I can add Spider-Man in, I will. He's also so cool because a lot of the Spider-Man allies are trait locked to Web Warriors, but this version isn't, so he can go into almost any deck. He's fantastic. And we talked about Angel earlier. Just if you're an X-Men or a mutant, you can reduce his cost by 1, bringing him down to a 2 printed cost, which is with 2 attack and 3 health. That's just incredibly efficient and a very solid ally. And he goes into almost every X-Men deck that I make. And then the final ally in the great options tier is going to be Mockingbird. It's so cool to me that the original core box came with such strong allies. Like when I first started playing, Mockingbird and Nick Fury went into every single deck I ever made. And they're still good to this day, which is really cool. But you get to stun an enemy, you can attack, and then block. So she blocks 2, similar to Colossus. And it's pretty cheap. Very, very good ally. Now, jumping up into the next tier, auto-include. So generally down here, I would grab these allies if I'm trying to do something thematic. But above this, if you're not playing these allies, you're hindering yourself. So the first one is going to be Professor X, which if you're trying to make a strong deck, he's just got to go in. He can confuse the villain and thwart 3 and then block. So he allows your alter ego abilities to... You get access to your alter ego abilities. Think about like Peter Parker Spider-Man flipping down, getting an extra hand size and a mental resource, getting to heal like 8 with Aunt May. That's crazy. And he couldn't do that in all the situations without Professor X. So he's just a great ally. And if you're trying to win against a hard villain, definitely put him in your deck. And then Ironheart. So Ironheart is a 2-cost ally, which is extraordinarily cheap and also lets you draw a card, which is incredible. Like, just in the beginning to middle of the game, you want to play Ironheart like every time she comes into your hand. Fantastic ally. And then graduating into the Zesty tier, which out of the objective allies, the ones that fit easily into this format, there's only one, and that's Nick Fury. The classic one. I already talked about him, but being able to draw 3, deal 4, or remove 2 threat is incredible. Because in the beginning of the game, you'll be drawing 3. If you get in trouble with the scheme, you can have him remove 2 threat and then thwart 2, because you don't always have a better option to thwart for. Like, thwarting is hard to come by depending on the hero you're playing. And then also at the end of the game, you can just deal 4, attack for 2, and then end the game like that. Great ally. He's one of the strongest in the game, and definitely deserves this Zesty tier up here. And then the final one, Moon Girl, makes it to the basically free category, where, as the name says, basically free. So it's trait locked to champions or geniuses, where, especially with geniuses, you'll have access to mental resources, which if you're playing, like you imagine you're playing like, again, Spider-Man, Peter Parker, and you have your mental resource on your alter ego side. There's the genius upgrade that generates mental resources, and you can just build your deck to have mental resources in it. And almost every time that you play Moon Girl, you're going to be reducing the cost by 3. So it's just like 1 card leaving your hand, and then you get to draw 3, which can completely change what you do on the turn. And if you're playing a genius, definitely include her in the deck. Champions, again, not as good as geniuses, because in general there's less mental resources, but definitely still worth including. Because you can just build your deck around having some mental resources, and then Moon Girl will still be good even if you're not a genius. That wraps up the objective tier. So now that we've placed all the objective allies, the ones that easily fit into this list, we can now like sprinkle in the subjective allies and then try to think about it a little more. So starting off, Star-Lord, the first entry into the Masochist tier, which makes me very sad, especially since Star-Lord, the hero, is one of my favorite heroes in the game, and definitely isn't at the very bottom of the power tier lists. Star-Lord, unfortunately, is, because his benefit that he gets of having ranged and a little bit overstated for a 2-cost ally is really outweighed by the encounter card you get, and especially on harder villains, he does the opposite of what cheap allies do. In general, cheap allies will be better against more difficult villains, and Star-Lord actually gets worse because of that encounter card, and he's just not that good. So that brings us to our next one, which is going to be Long Shot. Long Shot is just, I don't really get the point of Long Shot, because It's a very expensive ally, right? At 4 cost, very expensive. And the ability feels almost useless because it only works on non-elite minions. And non-elite minions are going to have like 3, 4 health, roughly. Generally, if it's like a really tanky minion, it's going to be an elite minion, not a non-elite. And then his ability, he has to attack that non-elite minion. So he'll deal 2 damage to it. And then you discard the top card of the encounter deck. And if it has a star, you get to defeat the minion. So his ability doesn't work every time. And then even if it does work, it only deals like 1 to 2 damage, which is just not very good. His cost is just too high. I feel like he needs to have like either the ability to defeat elite minions, which would put him in a really cool tier, but also it's not a thematic thing. So like you can't imagine like if you're in a comic book and long shot, just like one shot Dark Phoenix, that wouldn't make any sense. So I see why they avoided saying elite minions, but still, he just doesn't really function in the way he's supposed to. Not well, at least. And then the final one, which is going to be Cannonball, which maybe you could argue he goes up to meh or situationally good. But the problem with Cannonball is that it takes 2 consequential damage and only has 2 health. So you're paying 3 costs, and if you don't have the aerial cards in your hand, which compared to other things in the game, like traits that you can add to your hand, aerial is one of the hardest ones to find. There's not as many aerial cards, then he just kills himself with 1 attack. So it's almost always better to play something like Blade when it's just going to be a blocker most of the time anyways. But I don't know. Let me know. Maybe there's some sort of Cannonball deck that's really good. And again, this exemplifies why this is the subjective tier, because the abilities are weird enough to where it's not just like a simple thing of where to put him on the tier list, but I think he deserves to be here. And then this one makes me sad. He goes right above Blade in the meh tier. Unfortunately, the effect allows you to look at the top 3 cards and then change the order, but you're still in effect, you're getting slightly less random of an encounter card, and he's 5 printed cost and 6 true cost to play him for an effect that doesn't do really all that much. There's other ways to order the encounter deck that are much better than that, and his cost is just too high to be efficient. Another thing that makes me really sad about Heimdall is that Thor just like can't afford Heimdall, which I feel like that's really sad because I would like to be playing Thor Heimdall decks. That would make me happy. And then I'm gonna move these up so it's a little easier. Then we get to Spider-Ham. So Spider-Ham is just a really weird ally. So it's similar to Venom, where no consequential, but you discard a card for off the deck, and then the boost icons deal damage. So he's in a weird spot of, again, he gets worse against harder villains, which in general you want your allies to get better against harder villains, where if you're playing something like Loki, that was like 3 and 4 boost really common, Spider-Ham just like can't activate, which can be really annoying. But there's also a chance that Spider-Ham just lives forever and just keeps on going, which I don't know. I think because he's a web warrior and that, I can bump him up to here, but still, he's definitely on the weaker side of web warriors. As you'll see, we get farther on, we'll get more web warrior cards. Then we get Venom, where Venom is again very difficult to quantify, but also deals you a hazard card, which, like Star-Lord, is really harmful. But his effect has actually dealt a lot of damage for me before, and his stat line is crazy: 6 health, 3 attack. He's just unfortunately, because he's so expensive, it's really hard to justify bringing him up any higher than this. But he's not horrible. He's not down here in this tier. And Venom, another thing I like about Venom is the way he interacted with the Sinister Motives campaign was excellent. One of my favorite experiences playing Marvel Champions was playing through that campaign and having the Venom ally be integrated into the story. It was really cool. Now we get to 2, I'm going to lump these 2 together, Lockjaw and Machine Man. So we're going to go like this at the bottom of situationally good. Because when they're good, they're actually very useful. But unfortunately, they're only really available to certain heroes, which they're not trait locked in the sense of like they're made specifically for heroes. They're just the only people that can really use them have an abundance of resources. So think of something like Bishop, where you have just so many resource cards, and if you don't add things like Machine Man or Lockjaw, you'll end up in a situation where you have nothing to do. And whereas if you had these two allies, you could put those resources to use somehow. And that's why, even though their efficiency is really low, I'm bumping them up into the situationally good tier because they truly are situationally good. And now we get to Deadpool, which is one of my personal favorite allies, and he lands himself about here. So Deadpool is a wild resource, which I value that quite a bit, having a wild resource, because that means that he's actually going to be able to do something even if you don't play him, right? You can remove attachments, that sort of thing. Get bonus effects from cards. So he's good even if you don't play him. And then if you play him in the mid to late game, probably mid game is his sweet spot, so you can actually use his ability. He can be really good because he outscales the acceleration tokens on the main scheme because like it only adds 1 each turn, but he can thwart 2, so it takes a little while for it to catch up. So there's a lot of cool builds with him. There's Voltron possibilities because again, he doesn't discard himself, so you can like buff him up a lot, and he's definitely situationally really good, and you can build a deck around him, which is kind of the idea of this tier, is that decks can be built around these allies, but they're not in general as good as the allies above them. And then we get to Cosmo. So Cosmo feels like a little history of a little piece of history of Marvel Champions. His ability is kind of crazy. So he isn't in general good though. So you have to have some sort of way to where you know what the top card of a deck is, and then he just sticks around dealing 1 damage, thwarting 1 the whole game until you need him to block, and that can be really strong. So like with Doctor Strange, they had to like rewrite the rule book because of how good he was with the invocation deck. And these days, you can still play him very effectively with Magic. I'm personally gonna build some Magic Cosmo decks, but outside of that, if you're playing it with just any other hero, it's still functional because 2-cost alloys are good, but just not fantastic. Landing himself here in the situationally good tier. But granted, in the before time where Cosmo could just cycle through the invocation deck, he would come like all the way up here, probably into Zesty. He's not free, but he is Zesty. And I think you can build a deck that would bring him up here, but you have to specifically build that deck. Then onto Vivian. So Vivian is another ally that's kind of hard to quantify. And like what you'd want out of a cheap ally, Vivian gets better the harder the situation. So certain villains, like think of like Venom Goblin's Glider. That card will just make you lose the game. Vivian can come in and blank that text box, and you get to actually have a second to breathe when you play Vivian, which can be very valuable, and then also is just so cheap. Fantastic ally. I think I'm going to move her up. So like Cosmo, I already bumped up. Deadpool, I already bumped up. But Vivian originally was here. I think Vivian deserves to be at the top of situationally good, because not always good. Not every villain. You don't need Vivian against every villain, but definitely one of the most situationally useful champions in the game. Now coming to Drax. So Drax is a very interesting ally. He outputs a lot of damage, right? Because 3 attack, 4 health. That's a ton of damage. But he has that restriction that makes it to where he can only attack the villain, which can be very detrimental, especially when there's a lot of minions coming out. So that's gonna like bump him down, and his 1 thwart stat isn't that good. So for the situational tier, I'm gonna bump him down, and then that lands him up here. Because with this, abilities that are good but hard to quantify, I'll bump up, and abilities that are a detriment, but hard to quantify, I'll just move down a bit on the list. But he's still a very strong ally. So again, looking at this more, Spider-Man or Rocket, I think that Spider-Man's better because the damage you get in a burst is incredibly valuable, where Drax has to stick around to do that. And Spider-Man isn't limited. So Drax is somewhere in here. Again, this is subjective, so this is a very debatable point. But I'm going to land Drax right here. This could be a little biased just because I really like Spider-Man Miles Morales. But again, somewhere in there. And then Snowguard. This is an ally that is very underrated in my opinion. I've always really liked Snowguard. Like I didn't feel like I missed out on the Snowguard ship like I did with Scarlet Spider and Hope Summers. But I don't see many people talking about Snowguard. The ability to have 3 of whatever stat you need is incredibly useful. It's like looking at Drax. If Drax was a 3/3, I definitely would have put him above Spider-Man Miles Morales, but he's not. He can only really attack, so it limits him. But Snowguard can be whatever you want. And also, the most efficient option is actually the 5 hit points and Retaliate one, at least for like a standard difficulty. In Expert, you'd want to probably use Attack or Thwart. But having 8 health on an ally with Retaliate is really strong. It's very comparable to Groot, but also comes with the ability to have 3 attack or 3 thwart, making it a better card in general than Groot. And now, we're going to get into the spider tier. So Spider-Man Hobie Brown is an incredible ally. The ability to discard top 3 cards of the encounter deck and deal damage equal to the boost icons is crazy. So in Standard, he's good, but in Expert, depending on what villain you're doing, he gets even better. So like again, that Loki example of having 3 to 4 boost. Against Loki, he's definitely up here, but it's only certain scenarios that he's that good. Like in an easier scenario, he gets outclassed by these other allies, but definitely super strong ally, and also Web Warrior, which helps out because of all that Web Warrior support. And that brings us on to Spider-Man Peter Parker. So Spider-Man Peter Parker is the first one other than in the subjective tier to make it into the auto include. Basically, every Web Warrior deck should probably include Peter Parker. There's ways to, like, he has that resource requirement, but there's many ways to cheat him like onto the field where you don't have to pay that. But also, Web Warriors in general have pretty good resources with like web shooters and whatnot. So he's very good. And technically with efficiency, he's like down here in the great options tier. But I bumped him up because he's a Web Warrior, and also because if you find any way to increase your stat line by 1 in either attack or thwart, he gets much better. So that lands him about here. And then onto Gamora. Gamora has you discard until you draw an event. Right? Yeah, you discard from the top until you get an event, and then you add that to your hand, which is incredibly useful. So it adds a card, and if you build your deck around it, likely a card you really need for event heroes. And she also has a pretty good stat line, being 2/3, and that puts her about right here, above Professor X, but below Ironheart. And then brings us to Agent 13. Agent 13 is an ally that I personally underrated in the past. The way I did the Agent 13 calculation was shield support that she would ready would be a helicarrier. So for her max case, I assumed she was readying helicarrier, and for her minimum case, I assumed that she just got to thwart 2 and then block. So readying the shield support is crazy strong, right? So she can thwart up to 6 and then block, and then also allows you to play more cards, because like readying helicarrier is like essentially a resource generator, which is very strong. And mid game with shield, she's one of the best allies you can get. Now onto Ghost Spider. So Ghost Spider is essentially just Gamora, but you can search your deck, and that makes her better than Gamora. Like she has the bonus of like Web Warriors being stronger in general than Guardians, I would say. Although they're both pretty strong, they both have support, but Web Warriors have a very streamlined strategy. And then also, uh, being able to search for an identity specific event is much more impactful than just discarding cards from the top until you get an event. Because you don't know which one it is, you can't choose. And also discarding cards from the top of your deck in the beginning of the game, you can lose upgrades and supports you need, and at the end of the game, you're getting closer to hazard cards that you don't want. So it's definitely a detriment to have it work that way, and so that's why Ghost Spider's better. And now we make it our second entry into the Zesty tier. It's going to be Forge. So Forge is 2 cost, so he has that going for him of just being extraordinarily cheap. But the ability, again, to search your deck for something, deck and discard pile for an X-Men or X-Force support and add it to your hand, is extraordinarily strong, and that opens up deck builds that otherwise wouldn't be possible without Forge. And he's very good. The only thing holding him back is that he doesn't have very good stats, but his effect is so powerful that it lands him all the way up here. And finally, on to Spider-Man Otto Octavius. So this is a card that I also, I always knew he was good, but I didn't really realize how good he is until I did this, because he readies a tech upgrade, right? So if you're playing Web Warriors, you're getting a resource basically for playing him. So like you bring him in, like let's say you have Web Shooter out, you bring him in with a Web Shooter, so that reduces his cost again. And then you get to ready Web Shooter, and then not only do you get to ready Web Shooter, he would already be good if that was the case, but you get to draw a card as well, which is crazy. He's like he's kind of like an upgraded Ironheart with the added bonus of being a Web Warrior, and his efficiency was so far above Nick Fury that I had to just put him above. So even though Nick Fury has the versatility in drawing 3, dealing 4, or removing 2 threat, Spider-Man Otto Octavius also has the lower cost and the Web Warrior thing going for him, which is just incredibly strong. And then the last ally on the tier list, which I talked about earlier, is White Fox. So again, White Fox is basically free, because if you, like, not even basically, like oftentimes will literally be free if you add her into the deck. And this is a very subjective one. So that thing I mentioned about the asymptotes approaching infinity, just like the math of doing this, she gets an infinite efficiency, which I didn't say her efficiency was infinite because of that. Like it wouldn't, like how do I even like deal with that? What, she's like in the super mecha ultra mega tier up here, like that doesn't make sense. And then her lowest case scenario is very bad. Like if she's in your hand and you can't get her back into the deck, you almost never want to play White Fox, because it's a 3-cost ally with just 1 attack and 1 thwart. But that best case scenario of being so being free, it's like characters like Domino and Iron Man and Bishop. And like with Iron Man, there's the added benefit of it being an energy resource. So I'd add White Fox to every Iron Man deck. But outside of those, you almost never really want to play White Fox, and she's not designed for like a certain group of heroes. Like she's not a Guardian or a Web Warrior. So with most of these other allies, they're not trait locked, so they want to go in every deck. But White Fox is like basically trait locked because you can only play her effectively with certain heroes, which is why I put her above Moon Girl. But like if you're just going off efficiency, again, like the infinite efficiency of just playing her for free would put her up here. But because she's subjective, and other than that, she has nothing going for her, whereas Moon Girl has a 2/2 stat line, which is good and will be far more consistent than White Fox, because you're not going to get White Fox that many times throughout the game. Moon Girl for geniuses is more consistent, which is why I added Moon Girl on top. But anyways, that's it. This is the tier list. We'll zoom out so you can see the whole thing. Down here at the bottom, we got cards that like hurt you and just don't really make all that much sense. But then as you can see, by the time you get to situationally good, these allies are incredibly strong. And one thing, Age of Apocalypse just came out, and uh, I'd like to see where you guys think that what are the new ones that came out? Legion, Marrow, and Triage. It's like, where do you think they go in this tier list? Because using this reference point that I made, based with those efficiencies, I think that'd be really fun to see like where you guys put him, or also if you just want to do the math and figure out where he is, where those characters go first. I'd love to hear it. And if you've stuck around this song, make sure to like and subscribe, and then tell me what you think in the comments. Do you think I'm right? Do you think this system doesn't work at all? Do you think it's great? What things, like, what one of those assumptions do you think is like valid versus bad? And also, what do you think of the list? Until then, until the next time, stay zesty.